The plan for this morning is that we continue with our case study on the US. Last time we worked on, we discussed US state tradition in historical perspective, critical junctures, okay, milestones in US history, and we've seen how the federal government, in fact, was built, how the federation, how the union was built, and how the federal government, in fact, expanded through time. So you see the penetrative ability of the US state in historical perspective. Remember we talked about, in the 20th century, the New Deal, and then afterwards, 21st century, after 9/11, expanding federal jurisdiction competences at the national level. Okay, so now that we've completed that discussion, I'd like to start off with political economy of economic and social policies, what kind of a model we have in the US in terms of economic organization, economic coordination, and also what kind of a welfare state do we have in the US. Okay, so those are the questions that I shall be talking about now in the next hour. Let me skip all this and arrive at part 2. The idea of laissez-faire. When liberal economy. So the doctrine of laissez-faire, what time would that date back to in world historical perspective? So from the 16th century, from 1500s till about the 18th century, mid-18th century, we have the reign of what kind of an economic doctrine? Mercantilism, very good. So after mercantilism, the father of economic sciences, which was then called political economy, the principles. So Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, 1776, the doctrine of laissez-faire was introduced or was consolidated. In fact, there is some argument about whether Adam Smith himself was really propagating laissez-faire or not, but still we owe it to the conception of a night watchman state, which provides basic infrastructure and delivers justice, right, to Smithian conceptions of political economy, what makes the role of the government in the economy. So the idea of the doctrine of laissez-faire had been there since US was born, United States was born, from the 18th century, 19th century onwards. The US state is a rather archetypical, what's called an LME. LME stands for liberal market economy. There has been growing a new literature in comparative politics in general and comparative political economy in particular that looks at advanced industrialized economies and that really distinguishes between two archetypical ideal type forms of economic organization. One is called the liberal market economy. Examples of liberal market economies are the US, the UK, Western offshoots, including Canada, New Zealand, Australia, to a certain extent Ireland. Okay? And the second type is called coordinated market economies. Examples or prime examples are continental European countries, especially Germany, Austria, to a certain extent the Netherlands, and the Nordics, represented by the archetypical case of Sweden, okay? Scandinavians. So we see two different or distinct, analytically and empirically distinct ways of organizing their economies. One is called, once again, the liberal market economy, and the other is called the coordinated market economy. The US is a prime example of a liberal market economy. The liberal market economy rests on markets. Laissez-faire has been an important doctrine in terms of paradigms and principles. In coordinated market economies, there is state intervention, much more so in comparison to labor market, to liberal market economies. And coordination is carried out in more hierarchical ways, as opposed to market-based ways in the liberal market economies. In the liberal market economy, in this particular example, we see the importance of government, but of limited interference. So less interventionist government in the economy. Less intervention does not mean that we have a small government. We don't have a very small government. We have quite a hefty government in terms of its size or its power or strength or size in the economy, the extent to which the government intervenes into the economy. We see France, for example, 56% as a share of GDP. Remember the bit, we can talk about, if I can find a board marker. Okay, here is one. Remember, we must have talked about the share of G as a share of, or within GDP, right? And this was basically aggregate demand is equal to consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. We've talked about this before, right? So it's basically here as a share of GDP. So, and GDP was what? The value of all goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. And G would represent the size of government in the economy, the size of basically its government expenditures on all those goods that have been produced in that particular economy in that particular year, right? The size of government, look at this. More than half of all goods and services produced in the French economy are purchased by the French state. So the French state spends more than half of whatever that is produced in the French economy. UK is about 50%, so 50-50. So private expenditures versus public expenditures. These represent public spending, public expenditures as a share of entire range of goods and services. Germany hovers around 46%, which is close to 50%. US and Japan spend about 40 to 42%. So if you compare US with France, you see some difference. Among the 5 cases where we will be studying, or we will be completing our studies on, you see the Japanese and the US cases are towards the lower end, whereas the French and the British cases are towards the higher end. And Germany rests around in the middle. So this is basically G as a share of GDP, G as government expenditure as a share of total value of all goods and services, of all expenditures. And with respect to public employment, so employment by the public sector, civil service, that is, bureaucracy from tip to toe, okay? We see quite a differential here. The British state is the largest. About a quarter of the entire workforce is employed by the British state. So British workforce, a quarter of everyone working in Britain, it's hard to believe, works for the public sector. We've got Japan at the other end, less than 10% of all labor force participants, labor market participants, work for the public sector. It hovers around 8% of the entire employment or labor force. I think these are employment figures, not the labor force, but employment figures. Right next to the UK comes France. Remember we talked about this, 20%, which is a hefty number of millions. Then comes Germany, which is, again, as you can see, it's in the middle, 16%. Then 15% of the labor force, representing public sector employment in the US. Again, we talked about Japan too. Where does Turkey compare with respect to all these figures? With respect to the size of government in the economy, the relative share of expenditures on the part of the government within all expenditures. Turkey spends 1/3, more than 1/3. I mean, the Turkish state spends on all the goods and services, purchases more than 1/3 of all those goods and services, which is lower than the lowest here in Japan. With respect to public employment, public sector employment, Turkey is around 13%, which is lower than the US, but higher than the Japanese state. So if you could think of those in comparative perspective, I thought giving you an idea, I mean, like, because we live in this country, I thought, talking about this country would also give you a comparative perspective on public employment as well as public sector, the size of the public sector. Interestingly and historically, the model success, the success of the US model, the American dream, has been largely attributed, or generally attributed to, or widely attributed to the way of organizing your economy. So laissez-faire, competitive, free markets, less intervention into the economy, the doctrine as well as the practice of laissez-faire, really in the eyes of many represents an ideal situation, an ideal way of organizing your economy. So the Americans have always been concerned about what's called big government. So encroaching upon them, and in a way crowding out private investment. So the idea of big government is really not popular in the US. Has never been popular, except perhaps for the expansionary moments back in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression. That the government under, Roosevelt government, has undertaken all these reforms under the New Deal program. So in this case, we have what's called a market-based corporate finance system, where we have firms borrowing from markets. And there's no privileged access of firms to different financial industries or financial firms. Firms directly borrow from the market, or they continue with or through self-finance. And this is sometimes called as shareholder capitalism. The opposite of which, as we shall be talking about, is Germany. And I'll expand my discussion there. I'll give you an example of, I'll try to illustrate to you how stakeholder capitalism works and contrast that to the case of the US, okay? So I'll keep that discussion to my discussion in about a week or two on Germany. So shareholder capitalism for the US, stakeholder capitalism for Germany. less organized workers as well as employers. So trade unionism has been weaker. Employers' associations have been weaker. And in this respect, we do not have a coordinated market economy. Again, we'll contrast this with Germany's neo-corporatist decision-making, policy-making structures. We have instead here a more pluralistic way of organizing policy-making, decision-making processes. Okay, so we'll contrast that with neo-corporatist ways of policy-making and decision-making, and the relationship between managers and employees is largely adversarial, as opposed to, again, the archetypical case, Germany, where it's more consensus-based, and it's more social pacting. It's really coordination, as opposed to a more liberal, pluralist way of organizing industrial relations. So yes, we do tend to focus on laissez-faire when we talk about the US economy, but interestingly, there are many exceptions to laissez-faire. Even a laissez-faire system involves some form of government intervention, because it is historically governments which built politically, which built markets. One exception is extensive grants to newly born firms, especially those firms, especially in the high-tech industry. Most recently, we see new industries being incubated, and some of these are born with state finances, state funding through, for example, university labs. So there's public funding supporting these firms, which is an important element of, or important non-laissez-faire element in a system of laissez-faire. Assistance to ailing industries. So large industries, if and when they are going down the drain, they're making losses, then the state intervenes in order to protect these industries, protect its lifetime, or protect its accumulation. One prime example is Amtrak. It's the railway company in the US, which was founded back in the 70s. It was actually a private firm, but it was government controlled in the sense that it was administered by its administration was appointed by the executive. And Amtrak had always been an issue of contention and debate, whether we should subsidize, whether we should bail out Amtrak, what should we do with this ailing industry, because this industry was not making profits. Airline companies were making profits. Railroad company, the Amtrak, was not making enough of profit. So what do we do with it? Should we privatize it entirely? Should we subsidize it more, or should we take away any government control of it? So those have been the questions of contention and debate. Also, the agricultural sector had been, throughout the 20th century and well into the 21st, had been benefiting from government subsidies, all kinds of supports. One way of supporting the agricultural sector is the minimum price guarantees, which pays farmers a minimum amount in case they lose money or if and when they needed to leave their land to fallow. So when the government, or when farmers decide not to cultivate that particular year, to leave the land fallow, then the government steps in and subsidizes that year's produce. So leaving your land fallow would mean that supply of the produce would basically be lower. If supply of something goes low or short, what happens to the price? Just increases. Okay, so in a way, this is one way of stabilizing the price at a non-market, in a non-market way, in a non-laissez-faire way. Basically, through government subsidies, you basically increase the price. Another example or another policy is tariffs and quotas. Basically, protection from competition from abroad. One example is the sugar program, which dates back to early 20th century. Actually, New Deal era, the US sugar program, which it's a federal program which provides minimum price guarantees. So it provides farmers in the sugar industry all kinds of support, but also it provides tariff and quota protection for these farmers, meaning that by the end of the day, the government does not allow the price of sugar to plummet in case of an excess supply. So it limits competition from abroad through tariffs and quotas, and it also provides minimum price for sugar. Reduced risks of production by the state with the hands of the state through a crop insurance program, which is publicly provided. So the government steps in and reduces the risk of production. We know that the agriculture sector is cyclical, it fluctuates. So in order to avoid or tame the fluctuation, well, you can't tame the production itself, but you can tame market conditions arising from those fluctuations. So basically, the state steps in, and in case of crop failure, for example, the state provides through its insurance programs, pays farmers, in those cases. Subsidization of costs. What could be costs for the agricultural sector? What could be, typical costs of a farmer? Machinery, yes. Equipment, okay. Farming equipment. What else could be subsidized? Water. Supplements, okay. Fertilizers, chemicals, water, power. So the state produces or provides these at a lower cost than the going market rate. Okay, so the state provides these at a lower cost to subsidize the agriculture sector, to subsidize basically production of these farming establishments. Guaranteed purchases. What are guaranteed purchases? Any ideas? Who guarantees what? The government guarantees a certain amount of purchase. So the government says, I will store some of your production, and I will distribute this domestically later on. Okay, so the government steps in and purchases, promises to purchase a good amount of the produce that is produced by these units. So this is another support program which goes against the idea of typical laissez-faire ideology or doctrine or policies. Export subsidies. The government, again, not only restricts imports, but also provides subsidies to the exporting firms. One prime example is the sugar export subsidies. The government has been subsidizing those industries who are likely to export worldwide. So the government, in a way, builds the market, sustains the market, creates the market, recreates the market, supports the market, okay, through all kinds of microeconomic levers. So in a particular area, in a particular line of production, the government says, okay, I'm going to be supporting you as long as you produce, as long as you export this much. And on top of all these, workers in the agricultural sector, especially in the south, in this what's called the Sun Belt. So the government refrains from tight controls on immigration, so that immigrants flow in, especially from down south. They go up and they work in farmlands in the Sun Belt at lower, basically lower rates per hour. So native-born versus immigrants, their pay scale would be different. That's what emerges worldwide. So they come up north, up north meaning the Sun Belt from Mexico and other countries, and they help till the land. They take care of production in the farms, and they work at lower rates than the native-borns. So in a way, by turning a blind eye to immigrants coming in and working without all kinds of work permits and other paperwork, the government in a way indirectly subsidizes the agriculture sector. Is this clear? Okay? Because the government knows, well, we all know, that they'd be working for lower wages. And they come in a less restricted way, and they participate in production, and this means that the overall costs of the agricultural sector in those areas that benefit from immigration or immigrant labor power would be reduced or would be lower than otherwise. In addition to all these, so incubation of new industries or helping incubate new industries, assistance to ailing industries, borderline defaulting industries, supporting agriculture, we also have strong regulation, incisive regulation, powerful regulation, especially in some areas. Antitrust, so competition law is very important. It's a matter of immense or intense litigation. So the U.S. protects competition through antitrust laws, dating back to the early 20th century. But what's important here is that, yes, it goes in line with the idea of laissez-faire, but freer markets, yes, but freer markets means more rules, as in the title of this very important book by Robert Vogel. So freer markets, more rules, incisive rules, definition of rules of the game, not only definition, but also enforcement of rules of the game. Workplace safety, again, highly regulated. Environment is another area of increasing or expanding regulation. But there has been, the pace at which regulating environment is much lower in comparison to antitrust and workplace safety. So these are basically exceptions to the principle of laissez-faire. Yes, we have laissez-faire. We have the US economy as an archetypical liberal market economy based on the ideal of laissez-faire, much less state government, restricted government intervention in the economy. But by the end of the day, we see that there are many exceptions to the rule. And these exceptions are central to the functioning of the US economy. Okay? So the lesson to be drawn from here is that laissez-faire itself has to be, introduced, has to be maintained, but there has to be some state intervention, some kind of state intervention, even in the archetypical case of the US, of a liberal market economy. There's a lot of state intervention in many areas. That's what I want you to remember from this hour. Also, in terms of outcomes, okay, this is laissez-faire policies. These are the exceptions. What are the outcomes? Societal, social consequences of all this. We have a rather unequal, one of the most unequal societies among the advanced industrialized economies. Very unequal distribution of income. Well, it hasn't been that way all the way. Between 1920s and until about 1950s, end of World War II, we, in that 30 years is characterized by high levels of inequality. 1920s, anyone who's seen or anyone who's read the novel by Scott Fitzgerald, Great Gatsby, those of you, some of you may have seen the movie, that's 1920s for you, okay? Immense wealth, in a way, a late Belle Epoque, culture, life, production, stock market shares, profits, okay? The rich become richer. Everyone is becoming richer, but the wealthy becomes really rich, okay? The wealthy becomes really much more wealthy than before. And they also invest into the economy, but not to the extent that the economy can or wishes to absorb. So 1929, stock market crash, unemployment skyrocketing, this, that, and the other. The response is later on, 1930s, Roosevelt's New Deal. But between 1920 and 1950, in about that 25 to 30 years, we have high levels of inequality in the US. Then compare that to the consensus era, the golden age of capitalism in Britain and les Trente Glorieuses in France. So compare that to 1950s to 1980s, so late 1940s, late 1970s, we have, lower levels of inequality. So inequality high, 1920s, 1930s, 50s, 40s, 50s, lower 50s, 60s, 70s, again higher, starting to climb up by about 1980, and has been climbing up since then. The Gini coefficient for the US, does anybody know what Gini coefficient measures? Gini coefficient. Anyone who's heard the term Gini coefficient? Gini, it's a measure of income. It's not a measure of income per capita, but it looks at income brackets or income levels. So it divides, it's basically a measure of income inequality or equality. It's a coefficient that ranges between 0 and 1. 1 means most unequal, and 0 means most equal. So it compares how different income groups within a society are similar to one another. I mean, if the top 20% of income holders receive 20% of GDP or as income, if the second 20% receives another 20%, and the third and the fourth and the fifth, they all receive an equal share of 20% each, then we'd have a Gini of 0. Okay? So everyone gets an equal share of income. So income distribution would be, in an ideal world, absolute equality. But we know that it never happens. So in Nordic countries, in Sweden, Norway, for example, this is 0.25, most equal, one of the most, Norway, Sweden, these are the most equal societies, or two of the most equal societies in the world. We have in the US the Gini coefficient. By the way, in the European Union, this is in the range of 0.3 to 0.35, 35. In the US, this is higher than 0.40. I believe it to be so. It's the highest among advanced industrialized countries, 0.42 or 41, which is very similar to the income distribution. Represented in the Gini figure for Turkey, which is again hovers around 0.4, 0.42, 0.41, 0.43. So we have, a highly unequal distribution of income in the US. Your book mentions some figures in terms of income distribution across racial groups. Your book reports, the textbook reports for 2009, whites on average make around $29,000 per year. Hispanics make around $14,000 per year, so basically less than half. Blacks about $17,000 per year. Asians make about $16,000 per year. So borderline to 30 for whites. Lowest is Hispanics, 14,000. Asians, 16,000. Blacks, 17,000. So there is a racial wage gap or income gap, as you can see from there. And the gender wage gap among women and men hovers around $12,000 on average. These are all yearly figures, as you can imagine. Okay, so and there's a gender wage gap of $12,000 per year, which is which is really humongous. And the top 5% of income holders hold more than 21% of total income generated in the US. So as you can see, we see a highly unequal society in terms of distribution of income. Progressive tax structure exists, but it does not necessarily help with or in eradicating income inequalities. Do we know what progressive tax structures look like? Did we talk about this before? Progressive tax structures. Progressive tax structures. Let's do an example. If your income is between 0 to, let's say, 20,000 per year, you'll be taxed at 10%. If your income is 20,001 to, let's say, $40,000 per year, you'll be taxed at 20%. If your income is 40,001 till 60,000, you'll be taxed at, okay, let me make it 20%. Let me be more lenient. And if your income is larger than 60,001 to 100,000, then these are all dollar figures. This is the tax rate. It's going to be 30%. And if your income is larger than 100,000, it'll be 35%. It'll be taxed at a rate of 35%. So as you can see, the rate at which your income is taxed is increasing in proportion to your income bracket. Okay? So this means that this is an example of a progressive tax structure. Okay? So we do have a progressive tax structure in the US in general, especially when it comes to federal taxation. But it doesn't really resolve all these inequalities. It helps a little, but there is some contention that it doesn't do much, because for there are exceptions to this. Lower taxing of investments. So because it's the country, the administrations or subsequent administrations, consecutive administrations would like to see investment into the economy by private entrepreneurs. The US state taxes less those investments. Okay? So if you are investing, yes, you're generating income, yes, you're generating jobs, but you're becoming more wealthy. So the wealthy becomes more wealthy, and therefore, as long as they invest or reinvest into the economy, they're taxed less. Okay? So there will be tax exemptions or lower rates of taxation for those investors. And also, the Social Security tax had been regressive. It's been changing in the sense that everyone has to pay into the program until the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, that was introduced back in 2010. This was the case. This has been changing. One of the aims is to change the system from 2010. But what's a regressive tax then? Progressive is this. Regressive is that even if you have a flat tax, so for everyone will be, everyone's income will be taxed at, let's say, 30%. So if you're making this much amount of money, you'll be basically, taxed at 30%, and if you're making this much of money, this amount of money, you'll be your taxation will be at 30% tax rate. So this would be an example of a regressive tax. This is an example of a flat tax, but the idea is that if your income rises and your tax rate does not rise, then in a way this is a regressive tax structure. Another regressive element is the value added, the goods and services tax. What we have in Canada as GST, goods and services tax, which is basically, or in Turkey, VAT, value added tax. It's neutral with respect to whomever is consuming the product. It's neutral with respect to the income of the consumer. So if paper is taxed at 15%, whomever needs paper will be purchasing paper at a 15% tax. Or let's say bread, right? Bread, the tax rate on bread is 8%, let's assume, which means that even if your income is in the lowest bracket, you pay 8% tax. And even if your income is in the highest bracket, you still pay 8% of taxes. This is another example of a regressive tax structure. Okay? So if we all pay the same tax rate for a product, for a good or a service we're consuming, that's an example of a regressive tax structure. State taxes, they're less progressive because, there is the sales tax, like the GST or the value-added tax. There are income taxes, and there are property taxes. And property taxes, rents include taxes. Everyone pays property taxes. But still, these are examples of regressive taxes. With respect to the Social Security tax, if your income was higher than 100,000 and something, you would not be paying for the Social Security taxes. So that's another example of a regressive tax. And once again, as long as you are making investment, as long as you're spending your dime on investment, you would be exempt from paying taxes. So income distribution looks like this: highly skewed distribution of income, highly unequal with respect to income distribution, or in terms of outcomes. But what about the welfare state? What does the US welfare state look like? Well, all social programs, with some exceptions, date back to the New Deal era. Under Roosevelt, the government intervened heavily to establish worker protection and welfare for the disadvantaged. So 1930s were years of expanding federal jurisdiction, federal competences in the area of social policy. So this was new. It wasn't, the founding fathers did not foresee this more than a century ago, that there would be a new need arising as a result of, for example, industrialization and modernization. So 1929, 1930, massive unemployment, so the state felt that it needed to build a new type of state, a new type of program, and hence we see the US welfare state being or crystallizing around 1930s. US was the only advanced industrialized democracy without a universal healthcare program for decades, until 2010. Okay, so 2010, the Affordable Care Act passed, or promoted by President Obama, and passed through both houses in the Congress. Okay, this was a time of unified control, as we've talked about, 2009, 2010. The House was controlled by Democrats, and the Senate was also under Democrat majority, and we had a Democrat US president who had been advocating a universal healthcare program for American citizens. Back in the 60s, when the attempts at providing a universal healthcare program were there, the first programs were installed, introduced, early 60s, Medicaid, Medicare. About 25% of all Americans did not have coverage, any coverage. So a quarter of the population back then did not have insurance, health insurance. So whenever they needed to see a doctor, it was basically out of pocket, entirely out of pocket. So this has been declining over the course of decades with the expansion of Medicaid and Medicare. For 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 90s. So it's gone down to 15%. So again, 15% of all Americans were uninsured. So absolutely no health insurance whatsoever. With the Obamacare, this is infamously known as Obamacare by its critics as well as its advocates. The Affordable Care Act was introduced in 2010, which was put into effect in full force in 2014. So 2 years ago, it was introduced. And here we see those uninsured going down to about 10%. So only about 10% of the U.S. population has no coverage, nationwide coverage by a program. So there has been so much debate, so much contention with respect to Obamacare. Well, before then, 1990s, Clinton tried to push through his agenda. Didn't work before then. So there was a lot of contention with respect to reforming healthcare. There was no consensus until about 2010, when President Obama introduced this system. Question over here? Many are questioning that. Trump has announced, I think this past Saturday, a week ago, that he won't touch most universal aspects of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. But he was so intent, he looked so intent on reversing, entirely, in its entirety, the act. Well, my intuition tells me that if a new program is introduced, especially in pluralist societies such as the US, there are client groups. So it is sometimes in such a system, it is difficult to reform a program. Reform meaning expanding a new program, introducing a new program. But it is even more difficult to retrench a program. So retrenchment is a treacherous ball game. You have to convince everyone. You have to convince your electorate, your constituencies. Don't forget there is elections, as we shall be talking about, every 2 years. Yes, the president is elected for 4 years, but there is elections on every even numbered year, as we shall be talking about for the House and for the Senate. So retrenchment is very difficult. I mean, reversing a program which has created client groups with all kinds of interest groups around it, with all kinds of interest associations, with industries, lines of sectors, working for it, working with it, working along it, and social movements who demanded those in the first place. If and when they're still there, even when you have unified control, will you be able to reverse all these changes? As somebody who's been studying welfare state retrenchment, I see it to be very difficult. This has been, I personally worked on welfare state reform back in the 1990s and early 2000s in Europe. Whatever I learned from there tells me that reversing or retrenching those expansions, especially in pluralist societies such as these, is very difficult. We have Paul Pierson, for example, who wrote back in the mid-1990s on dismantling the welfare state. We all thought that 1990s would see dismantling of the welfare state as we know it. All European welfare states, all US welfare state, British welfare states, under the conservatives, Reagan, Thatcher, Kohl, and others. Mitterrand's U-turn, right? We all expected, academics, scholars, even citizens expected this decade, 1980s, or these decades, 1980s and 1990s, to be decades of retrenchment, curtailment of benefits. It didn't happen. Or it didn't happen to the extent that we were sure that they would happen. Just didn't happen. Yes, there were some retrenchment, but in many cases there were cases of expansion alongside those cases. Okay? So, in the US, yes, there's been some retrenchment, even in Britain, some retrenchment, but at the same time, these are very, very popular programs. The NHS in Britain, remember we talked about the fact that the NHS, the National Health Services, as a program, is extremely popular among British citizens. The French way of organizing your life, the French model of society, which includes the French welfare state ideal. Can you reverse that overnight? It's impossible. With that, with those comparisons in mind, whenever I look at the US, whenever I hear about these, and after having especially heard Mr. Trump last Saturday, or it was last Friday, I don't remember which day, he said, "Okay, I'm going to keep the first couple of articles in the Obamacare, in the Affordable Care Act, which guarantees health care at a universal level." So universal healthcare systems are basically systems which provide provide publicly delivered healthcare for all citizens. Okay, regardless of whether you're working or not. Okay, whether you're participating in the labor force and whether you're paying premia, health insurance premia or not. So universal health care means that on the basis of citizenship, you're entitled. And 60s, 25%, I mean, coverage was 75%. 80s, 90s, early 2000s, coverage went up to 85%. 2014, 2015, coverage went up to 90%. Will all those people who are now covered, will they forsake their coverage? Huh? I mean, it looks to me quite iffy, but we can all be wrong. And that's what we call science, right? Being able to be wrong. We don't like to be wrong, but when I was writing my PhD thesis, there was a professor, I won't name names, who had been writing back in the 1990s that European monetary unification, the euro, with the Maastricht convergence criteria, with all kinds of strictures on spending, government spending, will really bear down on the European welfare states, will spell the death knell of the European social model. So this was the name of the game. And we all bought the scenario, and we all thought that, okay, the European welfare state is going to be dead in less than a year. So by about 1999, by about 2001, welfare state, forget it. Gone down the drain. Then in 2002, the same professor wrote, I hope he's not watching me here. Well, I agree with him now. The same professor wrote an article, a chapter, that says how, well, the first couple of works were titled something like this: How the EMU Will Kill the European Social Model. 10 years later, he started writing a piece. He wrote a piece titled How the EMU, this Euro monetary union business, may even be good for the European welfare state. And I was talking to a colleague of mine in Brussels. I was saying, hey, my friend, again, I won't name names. He works at a large research unit who works with the European Commission, who really follows social developments in Europe very closely. And I said, this professor has been writing entirely the opposite of what he's writing now. In fact, we all agreed with him, 5 years ago. Look what he's done. And my other friend said, hey, Tolga, there is new facts, new evidence. And when confronted with new facts, we should be able to change our minds. And this is what we call science, isn't it? So he really reminded me of changing my mind when confronted with new evidence that tells me that I was entirely wrong. I wrote my master's thesis on this, saying, hey, EMU will kill the social model. EMU will be very bad for the unemployment situation in and across all around Europe. Unemployment had been really high, after the recession back in the 1990s anyway, and it's going to be skyrocketing because the state is going to be out of the picture, rolling back the state, retrenchment, no more welfare state, no more protection. Society is exposed. Markets will bear down upon citizens. Well, early 2000, when I was writing my PhD thesis, I looked at social expenditures. I looked at unemployment figures. Yeah, unemployment figures were high, but they were declining more or less. Social expenditures, I was expecting them to, like nosedive, especially in cases where many, many scholars thought there would be, clumsy welfare states. In fact, it didn't happen. In those cases where we expected most retrenchment, we saw either stability, don't tell anyone, even expansion in some programs. So we were flatly wrong. Like, we were doubly wrong because we expected these cases to go down the drain. Anyway, my point here is, coming back to the, Mr. Trump's treacherous ball game of retrenchment, or prospective ball game of retrenchment, whether he will be succeeding retrenchment. First, I personally think that he will retract from his pre-election cycle rhetoric. And there may be some symbolic cutbacks or some symbolic reversals, but I'm not expecting an entire reversal of what's out there. So this is my personal opinion. Based on whatever I've studied so far. You've asked this question to the wrong person, obviously. I kept on talking about this. Anyway, let me finish this and I'll let you go. Affordable Care Act, I will ask you to watch a documentary on the making of the Affordable Care Act. Okay, so we'll write an in-class assignment on this. So the politics of introducing the Affordable Care Act and how it came about, what it involves, but the backroom deals, how did the Senate and the House and the presidency work with it? Okay, so what were the intricate stories behind the scenes stories that culminated in the introduction of the Affordable Care Act? No standard unemployment and workplace injury programs. There's no federal program as such. Weak social security institutions in terms of financing. The government has been, has been in a way limiting the financing of the social security institutions. So they're less financially stable. There is much talk on this. Many argue that the funds will be depleted, funds will be exhausted if there is no reform. How could you reform this? You could either retrench benefits or you could increase taxes, right? You're really caught up between a rock and a hard place. This was referred to back in the 1990s. Same problems, pension time bombs, and all that. This was called what was this called? This was called squaring the welfare circle. So it looked something impossible. But by the end of the day, if there's political will, I've seen there was a way. We can talk about this later on. Weak unions, historically, traditionally, no promotion of class-based politics. Unions have been more or less called pork barrel systems or bread and butter, meaning that they were bargaining for wages only. These weren't politicized in general, traditionally. These were quite unlike trade unions, labor unions in the continental European or even British systems or countries. So there we have unions, taking up to the streets, protesting all kinds of cuts in terms of welfare states. We don't have that We don't have politicization of unions, trade unions, in the US case. So because two reasons are because of the level of individualism, more cultural explanations focus on this. There is an individual antipathy towards unions, unionization. Many citizens see unionization as a specific interest group and that they will be cannibalizing on profits. So there is, at the individual level, much distrust towards unions. And there has been, both federal as well as state law, which limits the ability of unions to organize collectively and to bargain collectively. So there have been restrictions through law, both at the federal as well as I believe in most or all states, that unions are restricted in terms of their abilities to collectively bargain and collectively mobilize. So because of these factors, there has been no class-based mobilization in the history of the United States or US welfare state. If there are no more questions, we'll meet next time. See you on Tuesday.